Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti a questo talk, questa presentazione di Archive Online Academy. Oggi avremo con noi Gregory Vandamme che ci parlerà di un argomento che questa volta non è strettamente connesso con le Digital Humanities, come di consueto è la tematica che Archive Online Academy predilige. Ma il dottor Vandamme è stato invitato a parlare del suo argomento di studio, Akbarian Anarchism, come sapete bene tutti dato che vi siete iscritti, perché ha passato 2 mesi a fare ricerca presso la Fondazione Cini e nella fattispecie è stato scelto, è stato selezionato fra altri studiosi per una borsa residenziale indetta dal centro Vittore Branca, il Centro Internazionale di Studi Vittore Branca, che è parte della Fondazione Giorgio Cini. Il centro Branca dal 2010 accoglie studiosi da tutte le parti, da tutto il mondo, proprio per sviluppare le proprie ricerche all'interno degli spazi della Fondazione Giorgio Cini e usufruendo quindi delle biblioteche e delle collezioni della Fondazione. In questo caso il dottor Vandamme ha svolto parte della sua ricerca sull'argomento alla Fondazione Cini e appoggiandosi all'istituto della Fondazione che si occupa effettivamente di civiltà e spiritualità comparate e quindi in stretto dialogo con il centro e con il professor Francesco Piraino. Ho cominciato questa presentazione in italiano perché so che molti di voi sono italiani e anche il dottor Vandamme lo capisce. La presentazione però sarà in inglese e quindi adesso poi si passerà all'inglese. Una precisazione prima di lasciare la parola effettivamente a Gregory, per gli studenti di Ca' Foscari connessi su Zoom che intendano accumulare crediti formativi CFU seguendo tutte le lezioni e i corsi di Archive Online Academy, per favore, come di consueto, inviate un messaggio privato all'account Fondazione Giorgio Cini, qui su Zoom nella chat, con nome e cognome, mail, anche orario di entrata e di uscita, così che possiamo tenerne traccia. Allo stesso modo, chi fosse interessato a ricevere un attestato di partecipazione e non fosse uno studente di Ca' Foscari, per favore avvisateci ugualmente nella chat, così collezioniamo le vostre presenze. Gregory, I think I will leave the floor to you. Thank you so much for being here. It has been a pleasure to meet you in Fondazione Giorgio Cini. Now we are a bit far away, so yes, we choose to have your presentation online. And well, I'm really curious, and I think I will leave you the floor instantly.
Okay, thank you very much. I will first try to share my screen.
Yes, I stopped my, yes.
Okay. Is it okay? Well, you see my screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah.
I didn't say this in Italian nor in English about the questions. If anybody has questions or well, reflections or different point of views, you can write in the chat. I can collect the questions and all, and then ask directly to Dr. Vandamme the questions. Otherwise, you can always raise your hand. Thank you.
Definitely, I will try to be not to be too long, so to leave the floor to some questions and discussions maybe at the end of the talk. So let me thank you again for the invitation. It's it's a pleasure to keep the link alive with the Fondazione Cini and to revive my memories of the fantastic time I spent in Venezia, of course. So yes, I will talk about a very interesting figure. I will say a little bit about him in a moment. But just to present from where I will talk myself, I'm not used to talk about contemporary thinkers or even less artists like Ivan Aguéli. I work on medieval philosophical, mystical thought, but here we have a very interesting case, a limiting case, as I said in the title, of an interpretation of a very important Islamic thinker on which all my works are centered, who is Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, and is a very unique thinker in the Islamic tradition, very prominent, very influential, and also very polemical. He is still a very often quoted and used author and spiritual authority today, actually. And what is of interest, as the title alludes to, what is of interest for me is to see how the case of Ivan Aguéli being so special, we'll see, so extreme in a vast variety of ways, how Ivan Aguéli is a limiting case to approach the interpretation and the application of Ibn Arabi thought in even today. So let's start to talk a little bit about Ivan Aguéli. So I will not give a real biographical sketch of Ivan Aguéli, but suffice it to say that he's very well known in Sweden for being a painter, as we saw on the first slide here. This is one of his paintings, but he's also a very prolific writer. He wrote in a little bit in Swedish, but most in Italian, in Arabic, in French, but also in English and even other languages. But yet he is not very well known in the world, even though he had an immense influence on the 20th century, but a very discreet influence. And this is already an interesting fact, because there is one of the doctrines of Ibn Arabi, of Sufism, of mystical Islamic thought, that Aguéli was one of the first to present to the Western world, is that of the Malamatiya. The Malamati, to be brief, is someone who, in his spiritual way, tries to be as discreet as possible and to avoid any form of publicity, to be far from ostentation and so on. So actually, he is the one who presented the doctrine of Malamatiya. He said that it is of crucial importance in his view, and we will see how it relates somehow to his anarchism. And he actually clearly managed to be a pure Malamati, because we know that he is the one who introduced a very famous figure, René Guénon, to Islam, to Sufism. For some people, he's the actual father of traditionalism, what will be known as the traditionalist school of thought. But he was also very influential in arts milieu, with someone like Apollinaire, who was very moved by his way to analyze cubism and cubist paintings in a very spiritual and metaphysical way. He's also very much implied in radical activism, in anarchism. He went 2 times in prison for his activities, sometimes for the feminist cause, but he's very well known for a terrorist attack he did on a corrida in France, and which caused actually the end of corrida in France. And so he was at the time he was sketched in caricatures in the French journals. So he was a very important figure. Yet today nobody knows him anymore. So that's a very interesting fact that at first it's probably a good reason to study him. And also, for example, he's the first writer to present Western feminism to Arabic Islamic audience in Arabic, in an Arabic newspaper. He's also the first to use the term Islamophobia in French. No, I think in Italian first, then in French, and it's still used today. But as I said here, what is the most important thing is that he is probably the true father of traditionalism. Like Mark Sedgwick said in a volume on Ivan Aguéli published in 2020, without Aguéli, the history of Islam during the second part of the 20th century, and especially in the West, would have been very different, actually. So in my own area of studies, I will replace Ivan Aguéli in the field of what we call Akbarian studies, which is the study of Ibn Arabi and his commentators. So Ibn Arabi, known as the Sheikh al-Akbar, so Akbarian or Akbari relates to the thought of Ibn Arabi. And Ivan Aguéli is one of the very first Westerner to study deeply Ibn Arabi, but we will see that he is the first to study it from a very traditional point of view, and to translate it into Italian, into French. And so he's the key figure and the first major figure in the history of the reception of Ibn Arabi thought in the modern West. And yes, I wanted to mention this, but the funding I had to stay at Fondazione Giorgio Cini is also accompanied by an issue of the Religiographies journal edited by the Fondazione Cini and the Center for Comparative Studies of Civilization and Spirituality, that will address all the contemporary uses of Ibn Arabi, and I will place this study on Ivan Aguéli in that volume. So what is interesting is when we look at Ivan Aguéli is that he is clearly addressing the notion of tradition in itself. He is moving our definitions or apprehension of what is tradition and what is in particular Islamic tradition and even Sufi tradition. As an anarchist painter, he is not what we will expect of a traditionalist or traditional Muslim thinker or Muslim mystic. But actually we see that in Islamic tradition we have a lot of non-conformist figures also of artists, but also all the tradition of corsairs in the Ottoman world until the 20th century. To quote some passages of his writings, he himself addressed tradition in a very interesting way. He says, "There is indeed much talk of a return to tradition in capital letter, if you please, yet no one makes the effort to explain what this truly means. We think of it differently. We have a higher notion of tradition. According to us, it is the very spacism that allows the rediscovery of the ancient tradition, that which is imprescriptible and forever young." But yet, Aguéli is not looking at tradition as something to catch from the exterior. He is the servant, as we will see, of the tradition, and he sees himself as really transmitting something. His very peculiar life and peculiar figure. For example, in a famous letter, he says, "My art my art shall one day explain the eccentricities of my life, I am the slave of a tradition I cannot deny. And in a letter, one of the last letters actually he wrote just before dying in Barcelona in 1917, he says to one of his friends, "Oh, ideal it would have been to be in an entirely wild and barren land when there was no other of the race of men, if only I had not had the tradition to defend." So he really bears that burden of being a true member of the tradition. So how should I study Ivan Aguéli? What is my approach? Is actually not to look at him as a Westerner looking at the East and like an Orientalist figure, but as we will see, to see that he is actually someone coming from the East, coming back from the East, and being the transmitter and, as I say, a translator of Islamic traditional Islamic thought in the 20th century. And to look at this after some biographical points, we will look at how he addresses both the relation to his anarchist ideals and also the Islamic tradition, and to try to apprehend the doctrinal perspective he has behind the very peculiar style of his writings, because he switches from really traditional Islamic, whether it be philosophical or theological or even sometimes juridical questions, to art, paintings, poetry, and so on. So I try to look behind the style and to see what is his true doctrinal perspective, to see if we can really read him as I believe, as a translator, an interpreter of Ibn Arabi in the 20th century. So to understand how Ivan Aguéli should be seen as coming from the East, I mean his writings, we should come back to a very famous figure, which is the Emir Abdelkader al-Jazairi, known as Emir Abdelkader, very famous because he was one of the fierce resistance against the French colonization of Algeria, very important figure, who then was imprisoned in France, had close relations even with Napoleon III and so on, and was soon to become one of the most famous Muslim figures at the end of the 19th century. He himself was the bearer of a tradition of interpretation of the writings of Ibn Arabi. He was himself a Sufi master who belongs to a very important tradition and to a very Islamic tradition. Murtada Zabidi is a very central figure in Islamic thought, but he was at this time also very much involved both in what we can call counter-reformism. It means that in the moment of the Nahda, the great cultural reform of the Arab world after the colonization, he was very much concerned with the modernization of Islamic thought, and he wanted to produce a counter discourse that would put in the center of Islamic thought again mysticism and a great philosophical question, and not only modern ideas, modern ideals, and modern aims for the Arab societies. And one of the main tools he had was to publish the writings of Ibn Arabi and write a lot of commentaries and also teach commentaries on his thought and on his writings in Damascus and in all the Arab world. So one of his closest disciples, the Sheikh Abdurrahman Alaysh, known as Alaysh al-Kabir, actually met Ivan Aguéli when Ivan Aguéli went to Cairo for the second time in search for Oriental wisdom, still very in a very Orientalist endeavor, and he took him under his wing actually, and trained him in a very traditional way. So he introduced him to the thought of Ibn Arabi, gave him access to manuscripts, taught him how to properly read him, etc. Agueli even became a student of the famous Al-Azhar Islamic University, so was very much into the Islamic traditional teaching, and took the name Abdul Hadi, through which he will be known in the West after. So the great moment to which we will come back is in 1911, when in Paris, Ivan Aguéli created a society that actually had no true accomplishments, a society for the study and the promotion of the thought of Ibn Arabi, called Akbarian. And among the founders of this society is René Guénon, who will be known as Abdel Wahid Yahya, and who will be the known father of traditionalist thought, and a very influential figure in France and beyond. And they created together this society that, as I said, will actually not produce anything, but as some already pointed, we should probably see the foundation of this society as the starting point of something that will have actually many fruits, which are both in Islamic studies, Sufi studies, but also in a more broad sense with the traditionalist movement, and the perennial school of thought, which is even very prominent in the US today. So where should we situate actually Ivan Aguéli? Is clearly between the Eastern and Western milieus. As we see, is himself identifies as the bearer of a tradition, as the servant of the tradition, and the best example of this is the Italo-Islamica review Il Convito, a Nadi, which was a journal edited in Cairo, both in Italian and Arabic, in which Aguéli wrote both in Italian and Arabic, and he wrote to promote the thought of Ibn Arabi and an understanding of the situation of Islam and the Muslim countries at the beginning of the 20th century, that was illuminated by this philosophy. Later, when he spent some time back in Paris, he then wrote in French a series of articles. Some were translations from the articles of Il Convito, but not all. He wrote some very important articles in French in the La Revue La Gnose, journal which was the first kind of official organ of the traditionalist movement in creation. And he introduced Ibn Arabi to the Western audience through some translations, but mostly through articles of his own, where, as I said, he mixes traditional Islamic Sufi thought with anarchism, art, and contemporary issues and questions. So what is, I think, very important to keep in mind is that Aguéli is clearly situating himself in the East. Even though he was still an anarchist in his way, still painting, because he never quitted painting during all these years. That's very interesting. But he, for example, he very often signed letters by the name, his Islamic name, Abdul Hadi, but he signs Khadim al-Awliya, which means the servant of the saints of Islam. But as I said, he's still painting, he's still addressing very modern, very contemporary political issues. And this should be, as I said earlier, related to that counter-reformism of Emir Abdel Qadir, who himself, for example, wrote very interesting texts interpreting the art of photography from a totally traditional, spiritual and philosophical point of view. So he's actually really applying Abdel Qadir's hermeneutics and Abdel Qadir's program, let's say, in his own field. So he's in a text dating the first text actually he wrote in a foreign language. He wrote in French in 1902 in the review L'Initiation. He clearly says that Islam is here to help the West, and he is trying to transmit the wisdom and the knowledge of Islam to help the West. So he's clearly situating himself as an Easterner rather than a Westerner. And also we see that in a lot of writings, he clearly stands against the anti-Western propaganda of some Islamic polemicists, for example. And he really stated that there are true Democrats, he says, in Italy, in France, in UK, and Muslims and Europeans should ally. So for him, Ibn Arabi is the key to help the West, but also to help the Muslim world. And as he says in Il Convito, in Ibn Arabi, everybody finds his own land, because his thought is both radical and absolutely universal. Yeah. So back when he came back in Europe some years later, what is different, of course, in the history of Western historicism, what is different between Agueli and others is that he is clearly more erudite, and we see in his writings that he is not like a common Orientalist figure. He really knows from the inside all the tradition, all the subtleties of the tradition. And what is interesting is that he comes back to some political issues, but with a very at first we could see a very naive take, as we'll say, but actually very I think very interesting. And it was very common in the esotericist movement in the West to have some political propositions, and what Agueli has to propose is probably very radically different than what exists at this time, which is a kind of Islamic Akbarian anarchism, actually. So here I quote, besides Who is Free is the name of the last exhibition of some of his paintings, but based on also some of his notes that took place in Stockholm last year or 2 years ago, I don't remember. But I think it exactly summarizes the approach of Ibn Arabi, the idea of freedom, but freedom as problematic, not as a given. So as we will see now through a brief analysis of what we can find in some of his writings, there are a lot of other writings to synthesize, but here I just print some sketches. He's clearly addressing the idea of freedom, as we will see, but looking at it in a very original way by placing it totally in the Islamic tradition. So yeah, basically the writings I base my analysis upon comes from both Il Convito, some articles in Arabic, some in Italian, and articles in the journal like Nose. So the first very interesting aspect is that for him, Islam, but not Islam as an abstract idea, Islam in its reality is a pure metaphysical and universal perspective. This metaphysical and universal perspective is that of what is called usually wahdat al-wujud, which is a way in which we define usually the thought of Ibn Arabi, even if it's not one of his own words, but which very interestingly Ivan Aguéli translates as supreme identity, which is not at all a literal translation, because he clearly uses a notion that is ontological, that is metaphysical, and with the idea of identity, he places it in a kind of, I don't like psychological, but he brings it back into the direct experience, which is actually the correct way to understand it. But he gives an explanation of the term rather than a translation. What is very interesting is that when he presents this idea of wahdat al-wujud, of supreme identity, he has in the French journal a very interesting take, and he says that actually the free thinkers of his time should have been our brothers, he says, but they lacked of width. They stopped at middle course, and they obeyed to the obscure instinct of the religious animal, and so they established as pontiff, as priests, exactly as the others. So what is interesting is that he's criticizing here the freethinkers of his time for not being universal enough. Actually, they are more religious than him, and he sees Islam as a metaphysical perspective less religious than the free thinkers. He has a very interesting definition of faith and of the experience of Islam and of the supreme identity as the high transcendental distraction. We will read this passage, but yes, first, this one is very interesting about the nature of Islam, that is, as I say, a very metaphysical one, not a sentimental one. Sentimentality is a kind of inner idolatry, as he says, in the same way as the idol is collective sentimentality in tangible form. Idol, priest, and sentimentalism are thus the three aspects of all anthropomorphic religions. Yet Islam is not such a religion, neither by the letter nor by the spirit. It loathes the idol, spurns the priests, except those of other religions, and shuns sentimentalism. What I place above all else, what is everything to me, that is my God. God is what distracts me from all that is not He. They who do not know how to gather themselves together on any given point of existence, they alone are the atheists. For faith, in short, is nothing but the high transcendental distraction. So we see here that clearly Agueli is giving a very metaphysical, very abstract definition of what is faith, what is a religion, and what is Islam. But yet, as we will see, it is still totally linked to all the most practical aspects of Islam as we know it as a religion. Another very interesting quote in an unpublished text. He says, Islam has placed the homeland of men, the homeland in the heart of man, which makes him feel at home everywhere. It is the only thing on earth that is stronger than atavisms and heredities. So, with that take on Islam in mind, how does Ivan Aguéli understands the nature of the Sufi tradition and the Sufi mystical practice? Actually, he defines Sufism and the Akbarian Sufism as a lucid mysticism, something that is very different from what we have in mind when we talk about mysticism. As he said, the lucid mysticism of the supreme identity should not be confused with those schools of past and present times that are commonly referred as mysticism or neo-mysticism, etc. We replace theology with mathematics. So here again, we see how he clearly shuns the sentimental aspects of religion, and he's clearly trying to formulate, yet in a very vivid and colorful way, something that is totally metaphysical and even here mathematical, as he says. How does the Sufi tradition act as the true preservation of Islam is because the Sufi tradition puts the emphasis on the knowledge of the self, and knowledge of the self is the key to freedom, because mostly because it is in knowledge of the self that resides the true metaphysical perspective. And as he says, looking at how thinking functions is as interesting as what we think actually. So another interesting perspective is that the ideal of what Sufism has in mind as spiritual realization and what should be the ethical practical realization of Islam is for Ivan Aguéli exactly what he already had in mind in his previous activities with, as we said, anarchism and animal liberations. For example, it says that the Malamatia is the highest degree of humanity, which is to be the servant of God and so the servant of everything in the world. For example, he says that Ithar, which would translate as pure. How do you say this? Sorry. The fact to prefer everything above oneself is only perfectly accomplished towards animals and not humans, because with the human we are always waiting for something in return, whereas when we are giving generously from ourselves, from our time, from our money, from everything to animals, this is the only pure and disinterested gift that we can make. So for him, the lucid mysticism of Akbarian Sufism should be accomplished practically in the world, and that's why he founds, when he's back in France, the society, as we saw, Akbariya, which is very interesting in its statutes. So we have the text of the statutes, because basically he says that in order to be a member of the Akbariya, one can be the follower of any esotericism possible. One can be following Buddhism, Taoism, he says, anything, but he should formally follow Islam. So it's not as we can we could expect from esoteric traditionalist perspective. Islam is not being here presented as only an esotericism. He clearly says that the only way to accomplish the ideal of this universal perspective on Islam, of the Akbarian Sufism and the Malamatia, is to observe externally, formally, the rules of Islam. And for example, he says that the only rule in the Akbarian society is that of Sharia, and we will come back to his notion of Sharia. So another very, very interesting and surprising take is the way he addresses the notion of this universal Islam and the notion of jihad at the time of colonization and of a lot of debates in the Muslim world, but also in the Western world around the resistance and jihad against the West. For him, a true Islamization is something that preserves diversity, and he sees this in history. Very interestingly, he says when Islam arrived in Persia, it made Persians even more Persians and Turks even more Turks. That it did not Arabicized everything, but rather it gave an impulse for every culture to foster within this universal perspective of Islam. And according to him, the situation of the colonized Muslim countries at this time is due to the fact that they lacked of jihad al-akbar, which is a spiritual jihad. This comes from a well-known tradition from the Prophet Muhammad of Islam, who returning from an episode of war, said to his followers, "We come back from the little jihad to the great jihad, to the jihad al-akbar." And they say, well, what is the great jihad? And they said, the jihad, the fight against yourself, the fight for the knowledge of yourself and against your own inclinations. So this is the reason for the possibility of colonization, because of course Islam was not preserved because it lacked of Sufism, as we saw just before. And also because in its relation to the West, Islam had nothing to preach to the West. The Muslim countries had no wisdom, had no metaphysical perspective to preach and to present to the West, so they just were colonized, and they just were taken into the perspective, the materialistic perspective of the West. So I don't know where I am in the timing. Yeah, I'm close to the end. Another, I will be quick on this, but another interesting and paradoxical view is that of the importance of the caliphate. So it's very paradoxical to see that someone who is clearly an anarchist is capable of loading the caliphate, and for him the caliphate is a spiritual one. It's not a matter of political leadership. This spiritual leadership is perfectly embodied for him, and he quotes the Emir Abdul Qadir, as we said, which is the perfect example of someone who realized the metaphysical perspective of Islam and the traditional preservation of this metaphysical perspective through knowledge of oneself. And for example, we see in the writings of the Emir Abdul Qadir that for him, in a war, there are no enemies. A war is something that is a natural phenomenon in which you have to take part, but there are no true enemy because God is on both sides. So this is clearly stated by someone who was one of the most famous warriors of the time. And for Ivan Aguéli, that is the true leadership, the true caliphate of someone who realized the perspective of the perfect man. But I want to end with this, with the notion of Sharia, of authority and freedom. So how does this relate to what we know of concrete Islam through the idea of rulings, of religious law, etc. For him, the foundation of Sharia is what he calls lordly freedom, liberté dominicale, which is even in French very, very, very strange. So being that when one access to this pure metaphysical perspective, that of lucid mysticism, one is truly free. And Sharia as a law, as a set of rulings, etc., it's a kind of ruling that knows that at its very foundation lies this pure metaphysical freedom. It's the only actually way to have a law, a common law that recognizes, acknowledges, and preserves this lordly freedom. I think we have, yes. This is an interesting text in which he alludes to this. The sacred law of Islam, the Sharia, which means the great path or the exterior path, encompasses material life with rites, ceremonies, and various considerations and obligations solely to teach us that things exist, how they exist, and the proper measure of respect due to their existence. The canonical laws of Islam are, without doubt, a social order, but above all, they are a magnificent treatise on symbolism, which assigns each thing to its proper place in the universal hierarchy. The speculative theology of the great Arab initiators seeks to prove that things are in fact theophorous, so that they bear the presence of God, in order to make us interested in material life in a different way than that of ferocious beasts. So we see that for him, Sharia, the purpose of Sharia is to access this metaphysical perspective, this lucid mysticism, as we saw of Sufism. So, and he said that there is a complete difference between the notion of authority in the traditional way and that of the modern way. And he has a very interesting defense of what is actually the traditional Islamic jurisprudential way to treat things. He says that actually authority in the modern law, in modern state, is from top to bottom, from rulings, leaders, etc. Whereas in the traditional way, authority is bottom up, because he gives the example of a fatwa. A fatwa is someone asking an advice to a mufti, and a mufti giving an advice to a particular individual, etc. So for him, Sharia is only concerning what he calls the average man. He clearly states that Sharia is never pointing to concrete individuals. It is a set of rules that should be applied and embodied every time in a new way by individuals. One of the clear a way he has to say this is it alludes to a very famous doctrine in Ibn Arabi, in which the idea of Lord, God as Lord, as Rab, is actually the individual relation between God and every human individual. As he states here, in correct religious Arabic, one may not simply say the Lord, Rab, without any opposition. Thus, one always says the Lord of someone, of something, of all, or of the all. Nowhere is the Lord proclaimed in an absolute sense. That would be the negation of individual freedoms by imposing unto everyone the same aspect or the same conception of the supreme being. So we see that very paradoxically, Ivan Aguéli is both very much emphasizing the need for traditional Sharia and both the need and the foundational role of individual freedom into this Sharia. So to draw some first conclusions, because I think it's really an ongoing work, and I had a lot of other things to share with you, but I think the bulk of it was clearly presented here, and I hope so. What I would say is that all these ambivalences and paradoxes that we see in Aguéli thought, for me, coming from the study of Ibn Arabi, there is no surprise at all, because they are all very typical Akbari and very typical ambivalences and paradoxes that we find already in the writings and the thought of Ibn Arabi. So actually, when we read a lot of reactions and commentaries on Aguéli writings being, nonsensical and kind of idiosyncratic, and so on, I think that the shift of perspective, that is to read him as a traditional writer trying to convey the traditional thought in a modern circumstances, I think it brings more coherence and even more clarity to his thought. Even though for us Western readers, it's very surprising to see Sharia as this. Actually, is exactly how Ibn Arabi sees it. So we should. I'm pretty much convinced that we should continue to read and to research Ivan Aguéli as a true interpreter of Ibn Arabi, rather than an original idiosyncratic Westerner appropriating the writings and the thought of Ibn Arabi. But that will be next stages of my research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If I can ask you, what about your next research? Do you have a specific plan, a place to go ahead with your research?
On this topic, yes, I still have other texts to read, and what I still have to do is to clearly put together passages from Ibn Arabi, from Emir Abdel Qadir also, and passages from Ivan Aguéli to show how all those ideas are already clearly formulated in the writings of Abdel Qadir in Arabi. The notes are there, but I did not write it already properly.
Thank you very much. Well, I remember to who is listening that this is a good moment to ask questions if they have. And I see there is a question for you.
Okay.
It's in Italian, but
okay.
Well, I can translate it. Which kind of materials, documents did you check, did you read or consult in Fondazione Cini during your residence? Okay, so actually in the library of the foundation, what was more interesting for my research was not the writings of Aguéli themselves, because, for example, unfortunately, there are no physical copies of Il Convito at the Fondazione Cini. I had to find it through other scholars, but they have, for example, very interesting historical copies of L'Initiation, which is an old French esoteric journal in which Aguéli wrote his first article actually in French in 1902, as I mentioned. So it was very interesting for me to read those other volumes, because we see, as I said very quickly, that they were very concerned with political issues, which is not
I mean, I found it surprising for an esoteric occultist journal to be very much into politics and into, okay, we have a new political system to propose, we should organize society like this. So actually the first peculiarity of Ivan Aguéli, which is to have a political interest, clear political interest, coming from this spiritual background, was for me yes, elucidated when I saw, okay, it comes from this milieu before even arriving in Egypt and in Sri Lanka where he studied. So he is already bringing with him these ideas. And apart from this, what is very interesting in the Center for the Comparative Studies of Civilizations and Spiritualities is that they gather a lot of secondary literature on all those milieus, all those personalities. So they are very specialized in the kind of milieu in which Ivan Aguéli came in after.
Thank you. I will just quickly link the Centro Studi di Civiltà e Spiritualità Comparate in the chat if some of you is not aware of the center. And anyways, from the site of Fondazione Giorgio Cini, where there is also the information about Centro Vittore Branca. So if some of you is interested. And
yes, I see there is another question there.
Yeah.
So the target of Aguéli's publication, I mean the audience, at first was a very limited audience of, as I said, occultist, theosophical, esoterical circles in Paris and in the French milieu. But it soon became very widespread, and that is the role and the importance of René Guénon, is that through Guénon, the writings of Aguéli were after read in a lot of different milieux. For example, we know that Guénon was, and so the Guénon and the journal of Guénon in which Aguéli wrote were very much read by the surrealists, by Breton, by people like this, even by Paulhan, all the people of La Nouvelle Revue Française and so on. So it really went into a lot of different milieus, artistic, even politics. We know that people like De Gaulle, like André Malraux, etc., were true readers of all this literature. So they had a very interesting role in that. For example, we know that it's through Guénon and his own disciple, etc., that the first real encounter with the Western milieus and Sufism took place and developed as real studies of Sufi thought, of Sufi writings, philosophy, etc. And so when we replace Ivan Aguéli in that historical chain, he's actually the real father. He's the one through which everything that we know much more about possibly came after his own endeavors.
Thank you. And well, mine is not exactly a question. Maybe it is like, so it was such an important link from the different cultures, and he was writing about freedom, tradition, authority, so very important, and very important for every time audience and societies. So why do you think it got a bit neglected for his history, or for his being so eccentric, maybe?
Yeah, definitely because he was too eccentric for the time. Because the people that were interested in that kind of things, for Muslim audiences, he was unbearable. I mean, who is this guy talking about Islamic tradition, but yet he is an a very well-known anarchist. He's a painter. He's a very eccentric figure, even in his clothing and so on. So he was too eccentrical for Muslims, too eccentrical for the traditionalist movement, because they were very serious people. And I think his kind of very colorful personality was not exactly the kind of spiritual father they were looking for. That's why I think the importance of René Guénon eclipsed everything. And he is always today, when you talk with people, is the father figure. But actually, everything, I would not say that everything comes from Agueli, but and I'm not the first to say this, the importance of Agueli behind René Guénon is immense, and yet completely underestimated.
Mm-hmm. A bit neglected. Also because, if I understood well, about tradition, he reflected not just on Islam, but like tradition in Islam, but also in other cultures. And exactly, so it's something.
Yeah. The idea that tradition is one, exactly, and exactly. So this kind of I think that is too universal for people too traditional, and too traditional for people that in their way think they are universal. That's why I love his attack on the free thinkers, saying, okay, my metaphysical perspective, it's truly metaphysical, but your universality is very small, actually, because you do not encompass, for example, every tradition as I do, etc. So yeah, I like this kind of provoking paradoxes.
Mm-hmm. I remember who just connected as well, that if there is any question or suggestion or reflection, you can write it down in the chat, or raise your hand to speak. In the meantime, where will you conduct your research in the future?
So actually, this topic is kind of a side job for me, because I work more on Ibn Arabi himself. But so, as I said, we are preparing now. We launched the call for papers for an issue of the Religiographies journal. That is to be published in 2024 on the contemporary uses of Ibn Arabi, and in which I will publish an article about what I presented today. But yeah, I probably will continue further, and I hope to turn it into a book, I think, on his figure and his importance in this tradition, and also on what he can actually teach us today, to our way to apprehend all those questions of religion, of tradition, of freedom, of authority, because it's very challenging. It's very he forces us to shift from our common perspective. So I think it's always a good thing.
Did you enjoy working on contemporary or not so old
that's
kind of materials?
I enjoyed it a lot, because when you work on a thinker, you always relate to him. No, it's I don't know how long, maybe 7 or 8 years that I am always in Ibn Arabi's writing, but he lived 800 years before me.
Mm-hmm.
So I always feel very distant from him, even though I kind of have the impression to know him, and even to have some shared moments with him. But with Agueli, what was really striking is the proximity. I felt really like, oh, I kind of feel the world he was living, because this kind of mix with arts, with politics, etc. It's clearly our world. So yeah, this was very, very interesting, and the fact that he was kind of a bridge between the ancient text I'm more used to and the world I live in. That was really, really interesting. But what is more difficult for me is that I'm less an expert on his own milieu and his own context. I know much more about medieval context and medieval situation than beginning of 20th century. So this was the most difficult part for me.
Well, can be a joint research with another scholar.
Exactly. That's why actually we the issue of the Religiographies journal, we co-edited with Professor Cedric from Aarhus University, who is the main expert on the field. So that's perfect for me. I will learn a lot.
Great. So thank you so much. And
you're welcome.
Since I don't see more questions, I think that for today maybe it's perfect. This is it. And well, thank you very much for the presentation. And well, I remember who participated that the video will be probably in some weeks will be also on YouTube on the channel of Fondazione Giorgio Cini. So to check it again or share it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.